Lion spots abandoned crying boy on the road. What happens next is unbelievable. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It was just after sunrise, the kind of morning where the air feels fresh and the world's still waking up, when an unsettling scene unfolded on a dusty road cutting through the heart of a wildlife sanctuary. A young boy, no older than 3, sat sobbing uncontrollably in the middle of the path, his tiny frame trembling. His red hoodie was dirt-streaked, and his tear-stained cheeks glistened under the soft light. The sound of his cries echoed through the stillness, piercing the serenity of the reserve. He was utterly alone, no signs of family, no vehicles, nothing but the vast, open savanna. From the tall grass nearby, a pair of sharp golden eyes glinted. Nero, a powerful lion with a thick, dark mane, had been lazing under the shade of an acacia tree after a restless night. The mournful cries tugged at something deep within him, pulling him from his drowsy state. His ears twitched, then swiveled forward as the sound became impossible to ignore. Rising to his full, imposing height, Nero stretched his massive body and let out a low, rumbling growl. The lion's presence was nothing short of majestic and terrifying. His every step was deliberate, his golden coat shimmering in the dappled sunlight. With each movement, the ground seemed to tremble under his weight. He began to stalk toward the noise, his amber eyes locking onto the small figure ahead. The boy's sobs caught in his throat as he finally noticed the lion. His wide, tearful eyes met Nero's piercing gaze. The lion's pace slowed, his head lowering slightly, and then a thunderous roar erupted from deep within him. The sound was primal, raw, a warning to anyone daring enough to approach his newfound territory. The boy froze, paralyzed with fear, his small hands clutching the edge of his hoodie. But Nero didn't attack. Instead, the lion began to circle him, slow and methodical, like a predator assessing a strange, unfamiliar prey. His movements were unnervingly calm, each step deliberate, as though he were trying to make sense of what lay before him. For minutes that felt like hours, Nero continued this silent, predatory dance. The boy, still trembling, didn't dare move. There was no one else in sight, no rangers, no passing vehicles, just the two of them, locked in a moment so surreal it defied all logic. Suddenly, Nero stopped. His muscles tensed, and his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something far off in the distance. The lion's nostrils flared, catching a scent carried by the wind. It was faint but distinct, a scent of danger. This wasn't an ordinary morning, and whatever had brought the boy here was about to unravel in ways no one could have imagined. Years before Nero became the fierce and dominant lion he was that morning, he had been a vulnerable cub, barely clinging to life. His story began on a scorching afternoon when Logan, a young and dedicated wildlife ranger, discovered him nestled against his mother's lifeless body. Poachers had struck again, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Logan knew, however, that raising Nero like a pet would be disastrous. Lions weren't meant to bond too closely with humans. They were creatures of the wild, with instincts that couldn't be suppressed. Once Nero was strong enough, Logan made the difficult decision to reintroduce him to the wild. The reserve had several prides, and Logan's only hope was that one of the lionesses would accept Nero as her own. Among the prides was a lioness named Zara, a seasoned mother who had just given birth to her 3rd litter. Zara was known for her dual nature, fiercely protective yet surprisingly gentle when it came to her cubs. Logan placed Nero at a cautious distance from Zara, his heart pounding as he watched. Would she reject him, attack him, or against all odds, take him in? For a few tense moments, Zara circled the cub, sniffing him curiously. Nero instinctively kept still, his wide eyes watching her every move. Then, to Logan's immense relief, Zara nudged Nero gently with her nose, signaling acceptance. The lioness had fought valiantly to protect her cub, but the odds were stacked against her. Logan found Nero trembling, his tiny paws pressed against his mother's side, letting out soft, helpless cries that barely reached the ranger's ears. For a split second, Logan hesitated. Rescuing an orphaned lion cub wasn't a straightforward decision. It came with risks, not only for the cub's survival, but for the delicate balance of the reserve. But looking at Nero's wide, frightened eyes, Logan knew He couldn't leave him behind. Carefully wrapping the cub in his jacket, Logan brought him back to the ranger station. Life as a surrogate parent to a lion was no walk in the park. For the first few weeks, Logan barely slept, waking up every few hours to feed the cub with a milk formula designed to mimic a mother lion's nourishment. Nero's cries often echoed through the small ranger quarters, but Logan never once lost patience. Slowly, the frail cub gained strength. His legs grew steadier, his roars, though still tiny, became louder, and his curiosity about the world around him blossomed. Over the next few weeks, Zara treated Nero as one of her own, nursing him and teaching him the ways of the pride. Nero grew quickly, his once scrawny frame filling out with muscle. By the time he reached maturity, he was no longer just another lion in the reserve. He had become a force to be reckoned with, a towering, battle-hardened lion who ruled his territory with unmatched strength. Leaving the pride to establish his own domain was a natural step, but it was fraught with danger. Male lions were solitary by nature, but encounters with dominant rivals often ended in violent clashes. Despite the odds, Nero thrived. Logan kept a close eye on him, tracking his movements and ensuring the lion's safety from poachers and rival males. Nero's reputation grew, his deep roars becoming a familiar sound across the reserve. Yet, despite his fearsome demeanor, Logan always sensed a unique depth in Nero, a quiet resilience that set him apart from the others. Little did Logan know, that same resilience would one day be the key to saving a young boy's life. The morning was deceptively peaceful. The sun had just begun its slow climb into the sky, casting long golden shadows over the savanna. Birds chirped in the distance, and the gentle rustling of leaves carried on the cool breeze. For most creatures, it was the perfect time to stir from sleep and begin their day. For Nero, however, this morning was different. He had been resting under the shade of an old baobab tree, his massive frame sprawled lazily across the dry earth. The lion's breath was slow, his mind quiet, until an unfamiliar sound sliced through the calm, a faint, high-pitched cry. Nero's ears perked up instantly, swiveling like radar dishes. His eyes snapped open, sharp and alert. He lifted his head, the muscles in his neck rippling as he sniffed the air. There it was again, that sound, a cry. But it wasn't from any animal Nero knew. It was something else, something fragile, something human. Curiosity overtook him. The mighty lion rose to his feet, stretching his enormous body with a slow, deliberate motion. The cry grew louder, carried by the wind, and Nero began to move, his paws landing silently on the soft dirt. His strides were unhurried but purposeful, his head low and eyes scanning. As he rounded a bend in the dusty path, the source of the noise came into view. A small boy, no more than 3 years old, sat hunched in the middle of the road. His tiny hands gripped the edges of his red hoodie, pulling it tighter around himself as he sobbed uncontrollably. For a moment, Nero froze. The sight before him was unlike anything he'd encountered. The boy was fragile, vulnerable, nothing like the usual creatures he hunted or confronted. But there was something else, something in the way the child's cries pierced the air, that stirred a deep, buried instinct within Nero. The lion's golden eyes narrowed as he took a cautious step forward. His massive frame loomed over the boy, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the little figure whole. The boy must have sensed the presence behind him, for he turned his tear-streaked face toward Nero. The two locked eyes. The boy's were wide and fearful, brimming with tears, while Nero's were unreadable, a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something almost protective. But before the moment could linger, Nero let out a roar that shook the ground beneath them. The boy froze, paralyzed by the sound, his cries silenced by sheer terror. Nero, undeterred, began to circle the boy. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if trying to understand what this strange creature was. Every so often he stopped to sniff the air, his nostrils flaring as he caught the boy's scent. Despite the lion's intimidating presence, there was no immediate aggression in his actions. He wasn't hunting the child. He was observing, calculating. Minutes passed, though to the boy they felt like hours. Nero's circling continued, his massive paws kicking up small clouds of dust with every step. The lion's tail swished back and forth, a silent metronome counting the beats of a moment that felt suspended in time. Then something shifted. Nero's ears twitched and his body stiffened. A new scent had drifted into the air, carried on the same breeze that had brought the boy's cries. This scent was different, sharper, more pungent. Danger. Nero's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. His muscles tensed, and a low growl rumbled from deep within his chest. Whatever had brought this boy here wasn't far off, and Nero's instincts told him it wasn't good. The lion positioned himself between the boy and the source of the scent, his posture changing from curious to defensive. For the first time, the boy seemed to sense that Nero wasn't there to harm him. The lion was protecting him. Logan's truck rattled along the bumpy dirt road, the morning sun bouncing off the windshield as he scanned the reserve for signs of activity. It had started as a routine patrol, a quick check of the fence line and water stations, but a faint sound over the engine noise made his stomach tighten. The radio crackled. One of the other rangers had reported hearing distant lion roars, unusually close to the northern perimeter. That alone wasn't concerning. Roaring was as normal as breathing for lions. But something about the tone of the call didn't sit right with Logan. As he rounded a corner, his foot instinctively hit the brakes. His heart nearly stopped. There they were, just a few feet ahead. Nero, the largest and most dominant lion in the reserve, stood rigid on the dirt road. His massive mane caught the morning light, making him look every bit the king he was. But it wasn't Nero's presence that sent a chill through Logan. It was the boy. A toddler sat on the road, his tiny frame dwarfed by the massive lion standing protectively over him. Logan's mind raced. How had a child even gotten here? The reserve was supposed to be secure, its fences tall and sturdy. Yet here was this boy, fragile and out of place, caught in what could have been a fatal encounter. Nero's body language was strikingly clear to Logan, though. The lion wasn't attacking, he was shielding the child. His stance was low but firm, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Logan squinted and followed the lion's line of sight. That's when he saw it. A second lion, smaller but no less dangerous, lurking in the tall grass. The tension in the air was palpable. Nero roared, a deafening sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. The smaller lion crept closer, its yellow eyes locked on the boy, but Nero didn't budge. Instead, he lunged forward, his powerful frame blocking the path to the child entirely. Logan snapped into action. Shoving the truck into gear, he pressed down on the accelerator. The Jeep lurched forward, tires skidding slightly on the loose dirt. The roar of the engine cut through the morning quiet as Logan raced toward the scene, his eyes darting between the boy, Nero, and the advancing lion. The smaller lion, startled by the approaching vehicle, hesitated just long enough for Nero to strike. With a force that made Logan's chest tighten, Nero charged, his massive paws hitting the other lion with a thud that echoed through the savannah. The fight was swift but brutal. Nero's sheer size and strength overwhelmed his opponent, and within seconds the smaller lion limped away, disappearing back into the grass. Nero stood tall, his mane slightly ruffled, and turned his attention back to the boy. Logan skidded to a halt, barely taking a second to throw the Jeep into park before jumping out. His boots hit the dirt, and he moved cautiously forward. The last thing he wanted to do was spook Nero, who was still lingering near the child. "Easy, buddy," Logan murmured, his voice calm but trembling slightly. He'd worked with Nero for years, tracking him, observing him, even saving him as a cub. Still, a lion was a lion, and Logan knew how unpredictable they could be. Nero's eyes flicked toward Logan, his head tilting slightly as if recognizing him. The lion let out a low, rumbling growl, but he didn't move. He was testing Logan, assessing whether he could be trusted. Logan raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace, and waited. After what felt like an eternity, Nero finally stepped back. He didn't retreat far, just enough to give Logan room to approach the boy. The child, now silent but wide-eyed, looked up at Logan with a mix of fear and relief. Logan scooped the boy into his arms, holding him close as he backed toward the Jeep. Nero watched, his amber eyes following their every move, but he made no attempt to stop them. The boy whimpered softly as Logan settled him into the passenger seat, buckling him in with hands that were still shaking. Before climbing into the driver's seat, Logan glanced back at Nero, The lion stood in the same spot, his powerful frame silhouetted against the rising sun. Logan didn't know what had driven Nero to protect the boy, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary lion. Logan drove the boy back to the ranger station, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The child sat beside him, clutching the hem of his red hoodie, his face streaked with dirt and dried tears. Every so often the boy turned his head, gazing out the window with wide, unblinking eyes. He seemed calm, but Logan could tell it was the kind of calm that came from sheer exhaustion, not comfort. Questions churned in Logan's mind. How had this little boy ended up in the middle of the reserve? Where were his parents? And why did Nero, a lion known for his solitary and fierce nature, protect him so fiercely? Logan shook his head, forcing himself to focus. He needed answers, and there was only one place to find them: the reserve's CCTV system. Once they reached the station, Logan carried the boy inside and set him on a chair in the small break room. The boy didn't resist. He just sat there, silent and still, his tiny legs swinging idly. Logan grabbed a water bottle and handed it to him. "Here, kiddo, drink this. You're safe now." The boy hesitated, then took the bottle with trembling hands. Logan left him in the care of another ranger while he rushed to the control room. The reserve's CCTV system wasn't perfect, but the cameras near the boundaries might have captured something. As Logan scrolled through the footage, his chest tightened. There it was, grainy but unmistakable. A battered old sedan rolled to a stop just outside the northern perimeter of the reserve. The driver, a young man, stepped out first, pacing nervously, as if checking for onlookers. Moments later, a woman climbed out from the passenger side, cradling the boy in her arms. Logan leaned closer to the screen, his breath catching. The woman's face was pale, her movements hurried yet tender. She held the boy close, kissing his forehead softly before carrying him toward the fence. Then came the heartbreaking part. She paused, looking over her shoulder at the man still standing by the car. He gestured impatiently, and the woman nodded, her shoulders sagging. With visible effort, she squeezed through a weak point in the fence, carefully placing the boy on the dirt path just inside the reserve. Logan watched as she knelt down, cupping the boy's face with her hands and whispering something, words the cameras couldn't catch. The boy reached out for her, his tiny hands clutching at her arms, but she pulled away. Tears streamed down her face as she kissed him one last time before scrambling back through the fence. The boy stumbled after her, his cries loud and desperate, but the man was already pulling her back into the car. The vehicle sped off, leaving the child alone, his cries echoing in the empty wilderness. Logan sat back in his chair, his jaw clenched tightly. The footage played over and over in his mind, the tender forehead kiss, the hesitant way the woman placed the boy down. It wasn't abandonment driven by malice, it was desperation. But why here? Why inside the reserve, where predators roamed freely? Did they think a ranger would find the boy quickly? Or had they simply believed this was the only safe place for him? Logan shook his head, unable to fathom their reasoning. He returned to the break room where the boy sat quietly, now nibbling on a granola bar another ranger had given him. Logan knelt down to meet the boy's gaze. "Hey, buddy, can you tell me your name?" The boy hesitated, his lower lip quivering before whispering, "Daniel." "Daniel," Logan repeated softly. "That's a good name." The boy's eyes darted to the window, and he pointed with a tiny finger. "Lion," he said in a small, awed voice. Logan glanced outside, half expecting to see Nero lurking nearby, but there was nothing there. Still, the mention of the lion brought Logan back to the strange connection between Nero and this boy. Somehow, despite everything, the fierce predator had seen Daniel as someone worth protecting. And now Logan felt the same instinct stirring in his own chest. He didn't know who Daniel's parents were or why they had left him, but one thing was certain. This little boy had been abandoned in the most dangerous place imaginable. And yet, against all odds, he had survived. Thanks to Nero. Back in the ranger station, the day stretched on as Logan tried to piece together a plan for Daniel. The boy sat curled up on the old couch in the corner of the break room, his small hands gripping a stuffed lion one of the rangers had found in the office. His red hoodie was still smudged with dirt, and though his tears had stopped, His wide, cautious eyes followed Logan wherever he went. Logan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching Daniel carefully. The boy's silence was deafening. He hadn't cried since the moment Logan had carried him from the Jeep. It was as if all his emotions had been locked away, hidden beneath a thick layer of shock. "Kid's been through hell," Logan muttered to himself. He glanced at his phone, scrolling through emergency contact numbers, but no one seemed to have answers. The authorities were working to trace the vehicle from the footage, but it was slow going. For now, Daniel was his responsibility, whether Logan felt ready for it or not. "Hey, buddy," Logan said, kneeling down in front of the couch. "You hungry?" Daniel blinked at him, clutching the stuffed lion tighter. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Logan sighed and stood up. "All right, how about I whip us up some lunch? We'll see if that gets you talking." As Logan rummaged through the small kitchenette, he heard a soft thud behind him. Turning, he saw Daniel had slid off the couch and was now standing near the window, his tiny hands pressed against the glass. "Lion," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. Logan followed his gaze, but the grassy plains outside were empty. Still, Daniel's fascination was clear. "You like lions, huh?" Logan asked, stepping closer. The boy turned, clutching the stuffed lion to his chest, and nodded. For the first time, a faint glimmer of excitement sparked in his eyes. "All right, kid," Logan said with a small smile. "How about we go see some real ones?" Daniel's eyes widened, and he nodded again, more eagerly this time. Logan chuckled. "That's more like it. Let's go." Minutes later, they were bouncing along the dirt trails of the reserve in Logan's Jeep. Daniel sat on the passenger seat, his hands gripping the door handle as he stared out the window with unblinking intensity. Logan had seen plenty of reactions from visitors on their first safari, but this was different. Daniel wasn't just curious, he was mesmerized. As they approached one of the larger lion prides, Logan slowed the vehicle, careful not to disturb the animals. A group of lionesses lay sprawled in the shade of a tree, their cubs playfully wrestling nearby. Daniel's face lit up, a smile breaking through the guarded expression he'd worn all day. "Look," Logan said, pointing. "See the babies? They're just like you, small, curious, full of energy." Daniel giggled softly, his finger pressing against the window. "Lion babies," he murmured. The sound of his laughter was a relief to Logan, who couldn't help but smile. For a moment, it was as if the weight of the day had lifted. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Logan spotted a familiar figure. Nero. The massive lion stood at a distance, his dark mane rippling in the breeze as he observed the Jeep. Logan's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, but he reminded himself that Nero wasn't a threat, not today. Daniel seemed to notice him too. "Big lion," he said, his voice filled with awe. "That's Nero," Logan explained, his tone softer now. "He's the one who kept you safe." Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the lion, his small face pressed against the glass. Nero, as if sensing the attention, turned his head and locked eyes with the boy. For a moment, the two simply stared at each other, an unspoken connection passing between them. Logan's chest tightened. He'd seen a lot in his years as a ranger, but this was something else entirely. As the Jeep idled there, Logan found himself thinking about the bond forming between the boy and the lion. It wasn't just coincidence that Nero had protected Daniel. It was something deeper, something instinctual. Logan couldn't explain it, but he felt it too, a need to protect this boy, just as Nero had. Whatever the future held for Daniel, Logan knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't face it alone. Logan sat on the steps outside the ranger station, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the reserve. Inside, Daniel was curled up on the couch, sound asleep, his small hand clutching the stuffed lion he refused to let go of. Logan stared out at the vast savanna, his mind racing. The authorities had called back with news. Daniel's parents couldn't be located. The car and the CCTV footage had been abandoned in a nearby town, stripped for parts, and left in a derelict parking lot. No other leads had surfaced. The news hit Logan harder than he expected. He had spent the last day convincing himself that someone would come forward. An aunt, a grandparent, someone who cared enough to claim the boy. But now, with that hope gone, the stark reality set in. Daniel would be placed in the foster system. Logan ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had no experience raising kids, no clue how to care for a toddler who had been through such trauma. But the thought of handing Daniel over to strangers, of him being shuffled through a system that might not understand him, made Logan's stomach churn. His eyes drifted to the horizon where Nero had appeared earlier that day. The lion's protective instincts had been undeniable, and Logan couldn't help but feel a strange parallel. He had rescued Nero as a helpless cub, cared for him, and watched him grow into the king of the reserve. Could he do the same for Daniel? Logan sighed and stood up, heading back inside. The boy was stirring, his small body shifting under the thin blanket draped over him. When Daniel's eyes fluttered open, they were filled with confusion and fear, but the moment he spotted Logan, some of that fear melted away. "Hey, buddy," Logan said softly, kneeling beside the couch. "You okay?" Daniel nodded, but didn't speak. His eyes flicked to the window, where the savannah stretched endlessly. "Lion," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Logan smiled. "You really like them, huh?" Daniel nodded again, clutching the stuffed lion tighter. "Do you know why Nero kept you safe?" Logan asked, testing the waters. The boy tilted his head, curiosity shining in his eyes. "I think it's because he saw you needed help, just like he needed help when he was little," Logan explained. "You two aren't so different." Daniel's lips parted slightly, as if he were about to say something, but instead he buried his face in the stuffed lion. Logan reached out, patting his shoulder gently. "Listen, kiddo," Logan began, his voice steady but uncertain. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but I promise, whatever it is, I'll make sure you're safe. Okay?" Daniel looked up, his big, trusting eyes locking onto Logan's. For the first time, the boy smiled. A small, fleeting smile, but a smile nonetheless. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Logan made a call that would change his life. The line crackled as he explained his decision to the authorities. "I'll take him," he said firmly, "at least until we figure out something permanent." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Logan, this isn't a short-term commitment. If his parents can't be found—" "I know," Logan interrupted, "but I can't just let him go to an orphanage. He's been through enough." The next few days were a whirlwind. Logan had to prove he could provide a stable environment for Daniel, which meant endless paperwork, inspections, and interviews. Every time he felt overwhelmed, he thought about Nero, about the lion's unshakable instincts to protect the boy. If a wild animal could step up, so could he. One afternoon, after what felt like the 100th meeting with a social worker, Logan took Daniel on another drive through the reserve. This time, they went straight to where Nero often roamed. The lion was resting under an acacia tree, his massive frame barely stirring as the jeep approached. "Look, Daniel," Logan said, pointing. "There's your big lion." Daniel's face lit up. "Nero," he whispered, the name coming naturally to him. As if hearing his name, Nero lifted his head, his amber eyes locking onto the jeep. Logan swore he saw recognition in the lion's gaze, a silent understanding between the two of them. "That's what family does," Logan murmured, more to himself than to Daniel. "We protect each other." The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink as the jeep crept along the winding dirt paths of the reserve. Logan drove slowly, giving Daniel a clear view of the open savanna. The boy was perched on the edge of his seat, his small hands gripping the dashboard as his eyes darted from one patch of grass to another, searching. "Do you think we'll see him?" Daniel asked, his voice soft but hopeful. Logan glanced at him and smiled. "If I know Nero, he's probably watching us already." That seemed to satisfy Daniel, who leaned back and hugged his stuffed lion to his chest. In the days since Logan had made the decision to keep Daniel with him, the boy had started to open up, little by little. He laughed more often, asked endless questions about the animals, and insisted on visiting the lions every day. As the jeep rounded a bend, Logan's hunch proved correct. There, not far from the road, Nero stood tall against the fading sunlight. His dark mane caught the golden glow of the evening, making him look almost mythical. "There he is," Logan said, pointing. Daniel's face lit up as he pressed his hands and nose against the window. "It's him! It's Nero!" Logan chuckled. Told you he'd be around." He brought the jeep to a stop, giving them a moment to observe the lion in his natural majesty. Nero, as if sensing their presence, turned his massive head toward the vehicle. His amber eyes glinted, and for a moment, Logan felt that same unspoken connection he'd felt the day Nero had protected Daniel. The lion's gaze shifted to the boy, who was now waving enthusiastically from the passenger seat. "Hi, Nero," Daniel called out, his voice bright and full of joy. To Logan's surprise, Nero responded, not with a roar, but with a deep, rumbling chuff, a sound lions often use to communicate with their cubs or members of their pride. Logan's breath caught. It was a rare thing to witness, even for someone who had spent years in the wild. Nero had accepted Daniel in a way that defied everything Logan knew about lion behavior. "He likes me," Daniel whispered, his eyes wide with wonder. Logan smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Of course he does, kid. You're special." They stayed there for a while, watching as Nero settled down under an acacia tree, his massive body stretching out as the sun dipped lower. For Daniel, it was a moment of pure magic, a connection to something wild and untamed, yet comforting and familiar. For Logan, it was a reminder of how far they'd come. That night, back at the ranger station, Logan tucked Daniel into bed, a routine that had quickly become second nature. As he pulled the blanket up to the boy's chin, Daniel looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Will Nero always be there?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Logan paused, then smiled. "As long as we're here, I think Nero will be too." Daniel nodded, his eyes drifting shut. For Logan, the weight of the day's events and the past few weeks settled heavily on him. Sitting by the window, he stared out at the darkness beyond the station. Somewhere out there, Nero was prowling his territory, a silent guardian over the reserve and, in some strange way, over Daniel too. Logan thought back to the first time he'd found Nero as a cub, trembling against his mother's lifeless body. He'd never expected that the tiny, helpless lion would grow into such a powerful presence in his life. And now, history had repeated itself. He had found another lost soul, this time in the form of a young boy, and had been given a chance to do for Daniel what he had done for Nero. It was a strange and beautiful full circle. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and the distant calls of birds, as Logan loaded the jeep for one more drive. Today wasn't just any day, it was a celebration. The adoption paperwork was finally complete, and Daniel was no longer just a visitor at the reserve. He was officially Logan's son. "Ready, buddy?" Logan called out, adjusting his hat as he leaned against the jeep. Daniel came bounding down the station steps, his stuffed lion clutched in one hand and a wide grin plastered across his face. "Are we going to see Nero again?" he asked, his voice brimming with excitement. Logan laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "Of course we are, he wouldn't miss this." The drive through the reserve felt different that day, lighter, freer. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, chattering nonstop about everything he'd learned about lions from Logan. The bond between them had grown quickly, built on shared moments of awe and trust in this wild, unpredictable world. When they reached the clearing near the northern boundary, Logan slowed the jeep and turned off the engine. Ahead, the golden grass swayed gently in the breeze, and the familiar silhouette of Nero came into view. The lion was lying in his usual spot beneath an acacia tree, his massive body relaxed but alert. "There he is," Daniel said, bouncing in his seat. "Yep," Logan said, his voice soft. "Let's go say hi." The two stepped out of the jeep, Logan keeping a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder as they approached. Nero's amber eyes opened, glinting in the morning sun as he watched them draw near. For a moment, Logan hesitated. No matter how well he knew Nero, he never forgot the lion's wild nature. But then Nero let out a low chuff, a sound so familiar now that it almost felt like a greeting. Daniel giggled. "He remembers me." Logan crouched down beside Daniel, both of them staying a safe distance from Nero. "Of course he does, kid. You're hard to forget." Nero rose slowly, his muscles rippling as he stretched. The lion stepped forward, closing the gap between them, his massive paws barely making a sound on the dry earth. Logan's heart raced, but he stayed calm, watching as Nero stopped just a few feet away. Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he held up his stuffed lion. "Look, Nero, it's you!" Logan chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Brave kid," he muttered. Nero seemed to study the boy, his head tilting slightly. Then, as if satisfied, the lion let out another chuff and turned back toward the clearing. He sauntered away, his tail swishing lazily behind him, but not before pausing to glance back one last time. "Bye, Nero," Daniel called, waving enthusiastically. Logan stood and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Let's give him some space. He's got a lot of territory to look after." Back in the Jeep, as they headed back to the station, Daniel was unusually quiet. He stared out the window, the stuffed lion still clutched tightly in his lap. "Everything okay, kid?" Logan asked, glancing over. Daniel nodded, then looked up at Logan. "Do you think Nero knows we're a family now?" Logan's chest tightened at the question. He reached over, squeezing Daniel's hand gently. "Yeah, I think he does. He's part of our story now, just like we're part of his." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Logan and Daniel sat on the porch of the station, watching the colors fade into the night. The reserve stretched out before them, alive with the sounds of nature. In the distance, a faint roar echoed, a deep, resonant call that Logan recognized instantly. "That's Nero," Daniel whispered, his eyes lighting up. "Yep," Logan said, leaning back in his chair. "Letting everyone know he's still the king out there." Daniel leaned against Logan's side, his small frame fitting perfectly under Logan's arm. For the first time in a long time, Logan felt at peace. His life had taken an unexpected turn, but sitting there with Daniel, he knew he wouldn't trade it for anything. Nero had once been a cub, rescued and raised to thrive in the wild. Now Logan had the chance to do the same for Daniel, to help him grow, heal, and find his place in the world. As the stars began to dot the sky, Logan looked down at the boy who had changed everything. "You know, one day, I'm going to tell you the whole story about Nero, how I found him, how he grew up, and how he saved your life." Daniel looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "And I'll tell everyone how he's the best lion ever." Logan chuckled. "That's a story worth telling, kid." As they sat there, the bond between man, boy, and lion seemed unbreakable. Their family might have been unconventional, but it was theirs, and it was perfect.